December 7, 1941. The world is about to change forever. The morning sun rises over Pearl Harbor, casting long, golden shadows across the still waters. For a few fleeting moments, everything seems peaceful. Battleships gleaming in the early light, sailors going about their routines, the air thick with the scent of salt and oil. But that calm is shattered in an instant. At 7:55 a.m., the sky erupts with the roar of engines as Japanese aircraft scream out of the clouds, their silhouettes slicing through the sunlight. Bombs begin to fall, and the tranquil harbor transforms into a scene of chaos, fire, and destruction. In the middle of this nightmare, Marine Gunnery Sergeant Tom Brewster finds himself running toward the armory, not away from the danger. 20 years in the corps have taught him to move toward the sound of trouble, not hide from it. Explosions bloom across the harbor, sending shockwaves through the ground. Machine gun fire rattles the wooden barracks, and the air is thick with the acrid stench of burning fuel. Brewster's hands are steady as he grabs his Springfield rifle, the same weapon he's fired thousands of times on the range. He checks the bolt, tightens the leather sling, and glances at the scope mounted above the barrel. A Lemon 5A, standard issue since the last war. But this isn't the rifle range at Quantico. This is war, and nothing about it is controlled or predictable. Through the drifting smoke, Brewster spots a Japanese pilot in a Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber swooping low over the water. The pilot's machine guns chatter, sending deadly lines of fire across the oil-slicked surface where American sailors struggle to stay afloat. The wounded and dying are everywhere, their white uniforms stained black by burning petroleum. The pilot banks for another pass, lining up on the helpless survivors. Brewster drops to the ground behind a concrete barrier, elbows digging into the rough surface. He brings the rifle to his shoulder, peering through the scope. At 800 yards, the enemy plane is little more than a dark blur against the smoke-filled sky. The Lehman's 5 power magnification, so reliable on the range, now feels hopelessly inadequate. The reticle, designed for stationary targets, dances uselessly over the moving aircraft. Brewster's training kicks in. Lead the target, account for distance, compensate for the crosswind that carries the smell of burning ships. He finds the trigger, feels the familiar resistance, and squeezes. The rifle bucks against his shoulder. The shot is lost in the thunder of explosions. Through the scope, Brewster watches as his bullet passes harmlessly behind the plane. A clean miss. The Japanese pilot doesn't even notice. He continues his deadly work, strafing the water, cutting down men who have no way to fight back. Brewster chambers another round, but the plane is already climbing away, out of reach. In that moment, a bitter truth settles in: the Marines are outgunned, outranged, and out of options. For Brewster, the lesson is immediate and personal. For the Marine Corps, it's a warning that will echo through every battle to come. Their equipment, trusted, familiar, and proven in peacetime, has just failed them in the most critical moment. The enemy can strike from distances the Marines can't even see, let alone hit back. And as the smoke clears over Pearl Harbor, a single question hangs in the air, heavier than the scent of burning oil. How did it come to this? How could the world's most powerful military be left so vulnerable, so blind, in the face of a new kind of war? But what if the answer didn't come from a military laboratory or a government arsenal? What if the solution to America's deadliest problem was quietly taking shape in a cramped optical shop in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, crafted not by generals or engineers, but by a German immigrant with a passion for precision and a stubborn belief that civilian technology could change the course of history? As the months pass and the war grinds on, the Marine Corps will be forced to confront its own limitations. Reports from the front lines tell the same story again and again. American snipers are being picked off by Japanese marksmen who can see and shoot farther than any Marine. The old scopes, relics of a bygone era, are no match for the new reality of combat. Young Marines are dying, not because they lack skill or courage, but because they simply can't see far enough to fight back. In a small workshop on Liberty Avenue, John Unertl runs his hands over a different kind of scope. It's not military issue. It wasn't designed for war. It's an 8-power target scope, the kind used by weekend shooters and competitive marksmen. To military experts, it's too complicated, too fragile, too civilian. But to Captain George Van Orton, a Marine with an engineer's mind and a marksman's eye, it represents something more. A glimpse of what's possible when you refuse to accept the limits of the past. As Van Orton peers through the Unertl scope, the world sharpens into focus. Targets 1,000 yards away appear with impossible clarity. For the first time, he can see what's been missing all along. But the question remains, can a delicate civilian scope, rejected by the experts and dismissed by the brass, survive the brutal realities of war? Can it become the backbone of America's deadliest sniper program? The answer is a story of innovation and resistance, of triumph and heartbreak, of men who risked everything to change the way wars are fought. It's a story that begins in the smoke and chaos of Pearl Harbor, but stretches across the islands of the Pacific, through the frozen mountains of Korea, and into the very heart of what it means to fight and to win. When the odds are stacked against you, and as the world hurtles toward a new era of warfare, one thing is certain: the battle for the future will be won not just by the strongest or the bravest, but by those who can see farther than anyone else. But how did a fragile, civilian scope, dismissed as a toy, become the secret weapon that changed everything? The answer is more complicated and more surprising than anyone could have imagined. The problem exposed, the attack on Pearl Harbor, was more than just a wake-up call for the United States military. It was a brutal exposure of every weakness, every outdated assumption, and every blind spot in American defense. In the days and weeks that followed, the shockwaves from that morning rippled through every branch of the armed forces. But for the Marines, the lesson was especially harsh. The old ways of fighting, the old tools and tactics, suddenly seemed as fragile as glass under the hammer of modern war. Casualty reports began to pour in from across the Pacific. Names like Wake Island, Bataan, and Guadalcanal became synonymous with desperate last stands and bitter losses. Again and again, the stories were the same: Marines pinned down by enemy snipers, unable to return fire. Patrols ambushed from unseen positions. Young men, trained to shoot with deadly accuracy on the rifle ranges back home, found themselves helpless against an enemy they couldn't even see. The problem wasn't a lack of skill or courage. American marksmanship was legendary, built on a tradition of competitive shooting and rigorous training, but the rifles and scopes issued to the Marines were relics of a different era. The standard Lyman 5A scope, a holdover from World War I, was designed for known distance shooting on carefully maintained ranges. Its 5-power magnification and tiny objective lens were more than enough for hitting paper targets at 600 yards in perfect conditions. But the battlefields of the Pacific were anything but perfect. In the dense jungles and shattered villages of the islands, the enemy fought from hidden positions, using every advantage the terrain could offer. Japanese snipers, equipped with superior optics and a ruthless understanding of camouflage, turned every advance into a deadly game of cat and mouse. They fired from distances that made them untouchable, picking off Marines one by one, then melting back into the shadows before anyone could spot their position. For the men on the ground, the frustration was overwhelming. Imagine crawling through mud and tangled undergrowth, every sense straining for the slightest hint of movement, knowing that somewhere out there, a single glint of sunlight on glass could mean the difference between life and death. The Marines' own scopes, so reliable in training, now seemed like little more than toys. At 800 yards, a Japanese sniper was nothing but a blur, if he could be seen at all. The reticle, designed for stationary targets, was useless against a moving, well-concealed enemy. The consequences were immediate and deadly. Patrols that should have been routine turned into bloodbaths. Platoon leaders, easily identified by their radios and binoculars, became prime targets. The psychological toll was just as severe as the physical. Marines began to dread the silent, invisible threat that could strike at any moment. Confidence in their equipment, once a source of pride, began to erode with every casualty. Back in Washington, the Marine Corps Equipment Board was inundated with after-action reports that painted a grim picture. Captain George O. Van Orton, a decorated marksman and engineer, read each one with growing alarm. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Engagement distances were increasing. Enemy snipers were operating with impunity at ranges where American rifles and scopes simply couldn't reach. The old doctrine, train hard, shoot straight, trust your gear, was falling apart under the relentless pressure of a new kind of war. The problem wasn't just technical, it was institutional. The military, like any large organization, was slow to change. The Lyman 5A had been good enough for decades, and there was a deep-seated reluctance to abandon proven systems in the middle of a shooting war. New ideas were met with skepticism, if not outright hostility. Proposals for better optics were dismissed as unnecessary, too expensive, or too complicated for field use. The phrase, "We don't change horses midstream," became a mantra, repeated by officers who had never faced an enemy sniper in the jungle. But the reality on the ground was impossible to ignore. Every day, more Marines were dying, not because they lacked the will to fight, but because they were being asked to do the impossible with equipment that belonged in a museum. The gap between what was needed and what was available grew wider with every battle. The enemy had adapted. The Marines had not. In the cramped barracks and muddy foxholes of the Pacific, the frustration boiled over. Letters home were filled with complaints about junk scopes and antique rifles. Marines improvised, borrowing hunting scopes from home or scavenging enemy equipment whenever they could. Some even tried to modify their own gear, wrapping scopes in oil, soaked rags to keep out the humidity, or fashioning makeshift sunshades from tin cans. But these were desperate measures, not solutions. The sense of vulnerability was everywhere. On Guadalcanal, Marines advancing across open ground found themselves pinned down by snipers firing from hidden bunkers hundreds of yards away. On Tarawa, the story was the same. Enemy marksmen, invisible and untouchable, inflicting casualties with cold precision. The old belief in American superiority was being tested and found wanting. For Captain Van Orton and a handful of others, the answer was clear: something had to change. The Marines needed better optics, scopes that could reach out to 1,000 yards or more, that could survive the rigors of combat, that could turn the tables on an enemy who had grown used to having the upper hand. But finding the right solution would mean challenging decades of tradition, overcoming bureaucratic inertia, and convincing a skeptical institution to take a chance on something new. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Every day the problem went unsolved, more Marines paid the price. The war was changing, and the Corps had to change with it, or risk being left behind. The search for a new sniper scope wasn't just about technology. It was about survival. It was about giving the men on the front lines a fighting chance, and it was about proving that, even in the darkest moments, innovation and determination could still tip the balance of war. But the path forward was anything but clear. The Marines needed a miracle. A piece of equipment that didn't yet exist, built by someone who understood both the science of optics and the brutal realities of combat. As the casualty lists grew longer and the reports from the front grew more desperate, one thing became certain: the old ways were finished. The only question was what would come next. And in a small, unremarkable shop in Pittsburgh, a German immigrant named John Unertl was about to offer an answer that no one in the Marine Corps could have predicted. But before that unlikely solution could take shape, the full extent of the problem had to be exposed. Every failure, Every loss, every hard lesson learned in the blood and mud of the Pacific. Only then could the real work begin. The unlikely solution, while the Pacific raged and the Marine Corps wrestled with the bitter reality of being outgunned. A very different kind of battle was unfolding in the heart of Pittsburgh. On Liberty Avenue, tucked between a hardware store and a delicatessen, stood a modest optical shop that looked like any other. But inside, John Unertl was quietly rewriting the rules of precision shooting. One lens, one scope, one sleepless night at a time. John Unertl was not a soldier. He was not a government scientist or a military contractor. He was a German immigrant, a craftsman whose hands bore the calluses of decades spent grinding glass and machining steel. His accent was thick, his standards uncompromising. In a world obsessed with mass production, Unertl believed in the power of the individual touch. Every scope that left his shop was a work of art, meticulously assembled, painstakingly tested, and built to standards that most manufacturers would have called impossible. Unertl's reputation among civilian marksmen was legendary. His 8 power target scopes were the gold standard at shooting competitions across the country. Weekend shooters and championship marksmen alike swore by the clarity of his optics and the precision of his adjustments. But to the military establishment, his creations were little more than curiosities. Too delicate, too complicated, too civilian, for the brutal demands of war. That skepticism was about to be put to the test. Captain George Van Orton, the Marine Corps' resident expert on marksmanship and equipment, had heard the stories. He'd seen the after-action reports, read the letters from the front, and watched as the casualty lists grew longer with each passing week. He knew that something had to change, and he was willing to look beyond the usual suspects for a solution. On a cold February morning, Van Orton boarded a train to Pittsburgh, carrying with him the hopes of a corps desperate for answers. The journey was more than just a trip across state lines. It was a leap of faith, a willingness to consider that the answer to the Marines' most pressing problem might come from outside the traditional channels. As the train rattled through the Pennsylvania countryside, Van Orton reviewed the technical specifications of the Lyman 5A for the 100th time, each line a reminder of just how far behind the Marines had fallen. When he arrived at Unertl's shop, he found a world apart from the bureaucratic halls of Washington. The air was thick with the scent of oil and steel. Workbenches were cluttered with half-assembled scopes, precision tools, and sheets of technical drawings, covered in dense, looping script. Unertl himself was hunched over a lathe. His eyes narrowed in concentration as he shaped a tiny brass component to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Van Orton wasted no time. He laid out the problem in blunt, unvarnished terms. Marines were dying because they couldn't see or shoot as far as the enemy. The standard issue scopes were obsolete. The corps needed something better, something that could reach out to 1,000 yards, survive the rigors of combat, and turn the tables on the Japanese snipers who had made the Pacific their killing ground. Unertl listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Van Orton finished, the old craftsman slid one of his prized 8 power scopes across the workbench. "Captain," he said, his voice heavy with both pride and warning, "this scope was never meant for var. It is for competition, for precision, for men who have time to care for their equipment. But if you think it can help, you are welcome to try." Van Orton lifted the scope, feeling its surprising weight and balance. The glass was flawless, the adjustments smooth and precise. When he peered through the optics, the world outside the shop snapped into razor-sharp focus. Targets that would have been indistinct blurs through a Lyman 5A now stood out in vivid detail, even at distances that had once seemed impossible. For the first time, Van Orton could see what the Marines had been missing all along. But the path from a civilian workbench to the battlefield was anything but straightforward. The Marine Corps was an institution built on tradition, and tradition did not yield easily to innovation. When Van Orton returned to Washington with Unertl's scope in hand, he was met with a wall of skepticism. The equipment board reviewed the proposal with the same cautious conservatism that had doomed so many promising ideas before. The official response was swift and unequivocal. Any new sniper rifle system will be based on the proven M1903 Springfield platform. The Winchester Model 70 proposal lacks sufficient field testing under combat conditions to warrant adoption during ongoing operations. We do not change horses midstream. It was a familiar refrain: reliability over innovation, the known over the unknown. But Van Orton was not so easily deterred. He arranged for a series of field trials at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, pitting the Unertl equipped rifles against the best the Corps had to offer. The results were nothing short of astonishing. With Unertl's 8-power scope mounted on both the Winchester Model 70 and the modified M1903 Springfield, Marine marksmen achieved 3.5-inch groups at 600 yards, sub-minute, of angle precision that blew past existing military standards. Yet even as the numbers spoke for themselves, doubts lingered. Master Sergeant Bill Harrison, a veteran range instructor with 2 decades of service, eyed the Unertl scope with suspicion. That contraption's got more moving parts than a pocket watch, he muttered, echoing the concerns of every Marine who had ever watched a piece of fancy equipment fail under the stress of combat. The external adjustment knobs, the sliding mount system, the delicate micrometer mechanisms, all seemed like invitations for disaster in the mud, rain, and chaos of war. The weather during the testing period did little to ease those fears. North Carolina's humidity was relentless, and when the rain began to fall, the Unertl scopes showed their first signs of weakness. Moisture accumulated on the external surfaces, and within hours, the adjustment mechanisms began to bind. It took careful cleaning and lubrication to restore normal function, a luxury that few Marines could afford in the field. Back in Pittsburgh, Unertl received detailed reports of every failure. He responded the only way he knew how: by working harder. 16-hour days became the norm as he ground lenses by hand, machined new components, and experimented with different materials and seals. His wife, Emma, brought him coffee at midnight, finding him hunched over his work, muttering about tolerances and the lives that depended on his craft. The mention of their son Hans, now training with the Marines somewhere in the Pacific, added a personal urgency to every modification. The biggest challenge was fragility. Under sustained field trials, the scope's mounting system proved problematic. The long tube shifted minutely with each shot, requiring constant re-zeroing. Humidity caused the external adjustments to seize, turning precise micrometer knobs into frozen obstacles. Military evaluators documented every failure with clinical thoroughness. Too fragile for sustained combat use, requires excessive maintenance under field conditions, not recommended for adoption. But the war would not wait for perfection. As casualties mounted and the enemy's advantage grew, the Marine Corps found itself caught between the need for innovation and the fear of failure. The Unertl scope, for all its flaws, represented a leap forward, a chance to level the playing field, even if only for a handful of specially trained snipers. The first production models began to reach Marine units in late 1942. Each rifle was carefully packed in wooden cases, accompanied by detailed maintenance instructions and specialized cleaning equipment. The M1903A1 National Match rifles chosen for the sniper program were precision weapons, originally built for competition at Camp Perry. Their polished bolts were blued to prevent reflection, their triggers adjusted for crisp, consistent releases. The Unertl scope, with its 8-power magnification and crystal clear optics, was the crown jewel, a civilian masterpiece pressed into the service of war. For the Marines who received them, the new rifles were both a blessing and a challenge. The potential was obvious. Shots at 800 yards or more, targets visible in detail that had once been unimaginable. But the learning curve was steep. Maintenance became as important as marksmanship. Marines were trained to disassemble and clean the scope's external mechanisms, to protect the delicate optics from moisture and dust, to treat their new equipment with a level of care that bordered on reverence. The Unertl scope was not a perfect solution. It was not even, in the eyes of many, a truly military solution. But it was a start, a bold, unlikely answer to a problem that had seemed insurmountable. And as the first reports of long-range kills began to filter back from the front, a new sense of possibility took root among the snipers of the Marine Corps. The war was far from over. The challenges were only beginning. But for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Marines had a weapon that could reach as far as their courage. And sometimes, just a little bit farther. Testing and resistance, the arrival of the Unertl scope in Marine hands was not the end of the struggle. It was only the beginning of a new, more complicated battle. The Marines now had a tool that could, in theory, match or even surpass the enemy's reach. But theory and reality are rarely the same in war, and the Unertl scope was about to face its harshest critics, the unforgiving conditions of the Pacific, and the skeptical eyes of the men whose lives depended on it. At Camp Lejeune, the first batch of Unertl-equipped rifles was met with a mixture of excitement and suspicion. The snipers who received them were a select group, men chosen for their marksmanship, their discipline, and perhaps most importantly, their willingness to try something new. Among them was Corporal James Mitchell, a quiet Kentuckian whose childhood spent hunting in the Appalachian foothills had made him a natural with a rifle. Mitchell's first impression of the Unertl scope was awe. He could see individual leaves on trees at 600 yards, count the buttons on a man's uniform at half a mile. "Feels like cheating?" he wrote in a letter home. But not everyone was convinced. Master Sergeant Bill Harrison, the range instructor overseeing the trials, had seen too many miracle gadgets fail under pressure. He watched as the snipers assembled their new rifles, his skepticism barely concealed. That contraptions got more moving parts than a pocket watch. He grumbled, echoing the doubts of every Marine who'd ever had to fix a jammed weapon in the mud. The Unertl's external adjustment knobs, its long, gleaming tube, and its delicate micrometer mechanisms all seemed like invitations for disaster. The first days of testing were promising. On the range, the Unertl scopes delivered accuracy that bordered on the unbelievable. 3.5-inch groups at 600 yards, sub-minute of angle precision, and the ability to spot and engage targets at distances that had previously been out of reach. The snipers' confidence soared. For the first time, they felt they could meet the enemy on equal terms. But then the weather changed. North Carolina's humidity rolled in, thick and relentless. Rain began to fall, soaking the range and turning the air heavy with moisture. The Unertl scopes, so flawless in dry conditions, began to show their weaknesses. Moisture beaded on the lenses, fogging the view. The external adjustment mechanisms, so smooth in the shop, started to bind and seize. It took careful cleaning and lubrication to keep them working. Time and attention that would be in short supply on a battlefield. The Marines tried to adapt. They wiped down their scopes with soft cloths, used oil to keep the mechanisms moving, and improvised covers to protect the optics from the rain. But the problems persisted. Every day brought new reports of scopes that wouldn't hold zero, that fogged up at the worst possible moment, that needed constant maintenance just to function. The frustration was palpable. For every Marine who marveled at the Unertl's clarity, there was another who cursed its fragility. Back in Pittsburgh, John Unertl read the reports with a craftsman's concern. Each failure was a personal blow. He responded the only way he knew how, by working harder, longer, and with even greater attention to detail. He experimented with new seals, redesigned the adjustment mechanisms, and tested every modification under simulated field conditions. His wife, Emma, managed the growing business, hiring more craftsmen and organizing production schedules to keep up with the military's demands. The shop became a hive of activity, every worker aware that their efforts could mean the difference between life and death for a Marine on the other side of the world. But the technical challenges were only part of the resistance. The institutional inertia of the Marine Corps was a force unto itself. The Equipment Board, led by Colonel William Sterling, remained deeply skeptical. Sterling's philosophy was simple, proven simplicity over innovative complexity. He had seen too many promising ideas fail in the mud and blood of combat. "We do not change horses midstream," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military tradition. The field reports from the Pacific seemed to vindicate Sterling's caution. In the humid jungles of Guadalcanal and the coral dust of Tarawa, the Unertl scope struggled. The mounting systems loosened under sustained recoil, requiring constant re-zeroing. The adjustment knobs seized, the lenses fogged, and the delicate mechanisms failed under the relentless assault of moisture, dust, and salt spray. Marines in the field, already burdened by the weight of their gear and the stress of combat, found themselves fighting not just the enemy, but their own equipment. The after-action reports were blunt. Too fragile for sustained combat use. One read. Requires excessive maintenance under field conditions. Not recommended for adoption. The words landed on desks at Marine Corps headquarters like grenades, each one undermining confidence in the program. Colonel Sterling seized on the negative assessments, using them to argue against further adoption of the Unertl system. "Gentlemen, I warned against adopting civilian equipment for military use," he declared at a heated board meeting. "These reports confirm that complicated mechanisms have no place in combat operations." But the war was not interested in the comfort of tradition. The reality on the ground was that Marines were still being outranged and outgunned by Japanese snipers. The old scopes were simply not enough. The Unertl system, for all its flaws, offered a glimpse of what was possible. A way to fight back, to level the playing field, to give the Marines a fighting chance. The decision to proceed with limited procurement was born not of confidence, but of desperation. The Corps needed something, anything, that could help stem the tide of casualties. The conditions attached to the decision reflected the lingering skepticism. Each Unertl scope would be issued with detailed maintenance protocols, special carrying cases made from moisture-resistant materials, and strict instructions for care and cleaning. Only the most skilled and disciplined snipers would be trusted with the new equipment. The rest would continue to make do with the old, familiar tools. For the Marines who received the Unertl scopes, the experience was a study in contrasts. In dry, controlled conditions, the system was a revelation. On the range at Camp Pendleton, under the California sun, the scopes delivered sub-minute of angle accuracy at ranges that had once been unthinkable. Marines who had struggled with the limitations of the Lyman 5EA suddenly found themselves capable of precise shots at 800 yards and beyond. Their confidence grew with every training session, their scores climbing, their belief in the new system solidifying. But the real test would come in combat. The first deployments of the Unertl-equipped rifles were to the Marshall Islands, Kwajalein and Majuro, where the relatively dry climate and open terrain favored long-range engagements. The initial reports were encouraging. Marine snipers achieved confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 900 yards. Enemy machine gun crews, once secure in their distant positions, found themselves vulnerable to American fire. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time, Marines felt they could strike back, that they were no longer helpless targets. Yet even these successes could not erase the memory of failures in harsher environments. The next major test would come on Saipan, where tropical humidity and coral dust would push the Unertl system to its limits. The snipers prepared as best they could, drilling maintenance routines, learning to protect their scopes, and hoping that the improvements made in Pittsburgh would be enough. The story of the Unertl scope was becoming a story of adaptation, of men and machines learning to survive together in the most unforgiving conditions. It was a story of resistance, not just from the enemy, but from within, from the doubts of seasoned Marines, from the skepticism of the brass, from the relentless assault of mud, rain, and salt. Every success was hard-won, every failure a lesson written in blood and sweat. And as the war ground on, one thing became clear: the battle for better equipment was as fierce and uncertain as any fought on the front lines. The Marines had a new weapon, but whether it would be enough to change the course of the war remained an open question. One that would be answered not in the workshops of Pittsburgh or the boardrooms of Washington, but in the jungles, beaches, and mountains where the fate of the Pacific would be decided. Into combat, triumphs and tragedies, the true test of any weapon isn't found in the controlled calm of a firing range or the careful scrutiny of a workshop. It's found in the chaos of battle, where every flaw is exposed and every advantage is paid for in blood. For the Unertl scope, the Pacific War would become a crucible, one that would reveal both its promise and its peril in the most unforgiving ways imaginable. When the first Unertl equipped sniper rifles arrived in the hands of Marine units in late 1942, they were greeted with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Each rifle was a marvel of precision, packed in a wooden case with detailed maintenance instructions and specialized cleaning tools. The M1903A1 National Match rifles, originally built for competition, now bore the weight of desperate expectations. The Unertl scope, with its 8 power magnification and crystal clear optics, was the centerpiece, a civilian masterpiece pressed into the service of war. For snipers like Corporal James Mitchell, the new system was nothing short of a revelation. On the training ranges of Camp Pendleton, he found himself capable of shots he'd never dreamed possible. Targets at 800 yards, once little more than indistinct shapes, now appeared in sharp relief. The scope's light, gathering power, made it possible to see in conditions that would have rendered the old Lyman 5A nearly useless. Mitchell's confidence soared. His shot groups tightened, his scores climbed, and for the first time, he felt that the Marines might finally have a tool to match the enemy's reach. But the Pacific was not California. The islands where the Marines would fight and die were a world apart. Places where the environment itself seemed to conspire against man and machine alike. The first real test came during the assault on the Marshall Islands. On Kwajalein and Majuro, the climate was relatively dry, the visibility clear, and the terrain open enough to favor long-range engagements. Here, the Unertl scope shone. Marine snipers achieved confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 900 yards, picking off enemy machine gun crews and officers who had once believed themselves safe behind distance and cover. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time, Japanese forces found themselves vulnerable to American fire at ranges they had considered untouchable. Mitchell's first combat experience with the Unertl scope came on the northern beaches of Kwajalein. Concealed behind coral formations, he watched as enemy soldiers moved between bunkers, directing fire against advancing Marines. Through the 8-power scope, he could see not just the outlines of his targets, but the details. The insignia on a uniform, the glint of a bayonet, the nervous glance of a machine gunner scanning the horizon. His first confirmed kill came at 820 yards, a shot that would have been impossible with standard equipment. The sense of empowerment was overwhelming. For a brief moment, the balance of power seemed to shift. But the Pacific was a place of extremes, and the islands were as unforgiving as any enemy. The next major deployment brought the Unertl system to Saipan, where the true limits of the scope would be tested. Here, the climate was a sniper's nightmare. Tropical humidity that soaked every piece of equipment, coral dust that infiltrated every mechanism, and sudden downpours that turned the ground to mud in minutes. The Marines prepared as best they could, drilling maintenance routines, learning to protect their scopes, and hoping that the improvements made in Pittsburgh would be enough. The reality was harsher than anyone had anticipated. In the jungles and caves of Saipan, the Unertl scopes began to fail. The long, delicate tubes that had delivered such stunning clarity on the range now fogged over in the humid air. The external adjustment knobs, so precise in the shop, seized up under the relentless assault of coral dust and moisture. The mounting systems, designed for competition, loosened under the repeated shock of combat, requiring constant re-zeroing. For snipers like Mitchell, the frustration was immediate and personal. During the savage fighting for Saipan's central highlands, Mitchell found himself in a life or death duel with a Japanese sniper hidden in a cave complex. The enemy had been systematically targeting Marine squad leaders, inflicting casualties that threatened to unravel the entire advance. Mitchell identified the sniper's position through patient observation, noting the telltale muzzle flashes from a narrow opening across a valley filled with smoke and dust. The distance, 400 yards, was well within the capabilities of his rifle, but the shot required optical magnification for precise placement. As Mitchell settled into position, the Unertl scope's objective lens fogged over completely. The humid air condensed on the glass faster than he could wipe it away. Attempts to clear the lens using approved cleaning procedures proved futile. The external adjustment knobs, now coated with fine coral dust, refused to move. Forced to engage using iron sights, Mitchell fired 3 carefully aimed rounds at the cave opening. The Japanese sniper responded instantly, his bullet striking Mitchell's cover and sending shards of rock into his face before a second round tore through his left shoulder. Mitchell's bitter radio transmission to his company commander captured the frustration of an entire generation of Marines. "This thing's more fragile than my grandmother's china. Request permission to use standard rifle for remainder of operation." The words were more than just a complaint. They were a cry of disappointment, a recognition that the promise of the Unertl scope had not been fulfilled when it mattered most. The after-action reports from Saipan were devastating. Unable to make effective use of M03A1 Unertl sniper rifles due to climate and terrain conditions. One read. Similar assessments arrived from other units operating in high humidity environments. The negative reports landed on desks at Marine Corps headquarters like a series of body blows, each one undermining confidence in the program. Colonel Sterling's voice, once a warning, now sounded like vindication. "I told you that contraption wouldn't work under real combat conditions." Yet even in the midst of failure, there were flashes of brilliance, moments when the Unertl scope delivered on its promise. On Okinawa, Marine Sergeant Robert Chen developed field techniques for protecting his scope, using salvaged Japanese silk to create moisture-proof covers. His kill record, 23 confirmed enemy casualties at ranges averaging over 700 yards, demonstrated what was possible when the equipment was properly maintained and the environment was less hostile. Chen's success became a legend among snipers, a testament to the idea that innovation and adaptation could sometimes overcome even the harshest conditions. But for every Chen, there were dozens of Marines who struggled with equipment that failed at critical moments. The statistical reality of combat demanded reliability, not just potential. Orders began to circulate, directing the phase out of the Unertl system in favor of more robust alternatives. The decision was painful but necessary. Marines who had invested months learning the intricacies of the new scopes found themselves retraining with simpler, less capable equipment. The psychological cost was real. As Mitchell, recovering from his wounds, put it, "Give me equipment that works 70% of the time over equipment that's perfect 10% of the time." Dead Marines don't benefit from theoretical advantages. The story of the Unertl scope in the Pacific was one of triumphs and tragedies, of moments when the impossible became possible, and of heartbreak when hope turned to frustration. It was a story written in the mud and blood of the islands, in the letters home from snipers who had seen both the best and worst of what innovation could offer. The Marines had reached for a miracle, and for a brief, shining moment. They had touched it, but the realities of war had a way of grinding down even the brightest hopes. Yet the story was not over. The lessons learned in the Pacific, the need for reliability, the importance of matching equipment to environment, the value of adaptation, would not be forgotten. The Unertl scope had failed to become the universal solution the Marines had hoped for, but it had opened the door to a new way of thinking about precision innovation and the relentless pursuit of an edge in battle. And as the war moved on and new challenges arose, the legacy of those triumphs and tragedies would shape the future of Marine sniping in ways no one could have predicted. Desperation and innovation. By late 1943, the Pacific Campaign had become a grinding war of attrition. Every island, every beachhead, every patch of jungle was paid for in blood. The Marines, battered by relentless Japanese resistance and the unforgiving environment, faced a grim calculus. Every assault meant more casualties, and every casualty was a reminder of the equipment that had failed them. The Unertl scope, once hailed as a miracle of precision, now stood at a crossroads, caught between the promise of innovation and the harsh reality of war. The decision to keep the Unertl system in service was not made out of confidence, but out of sheer necessity. The alternatives were few, and the enemy's advantage in optics remained a constant threat. Marine commanders, desperate to stem the tide of losses, authorized limited procurement of the scopes, but with strict conditions. Each Unertl scope would be issued with detailed maintenance protocols, special moisture-resistant carrying cases, and explicit instructions for care in the field. Only the most skilled and disciplined snipers would be trusted with the new equipment. For everyone else, the old, familiar tools would have to suffice. Back in Pittsburgh, John Unertl understood the stakes. The reports from the front were sobering, stories of scopes fogging over, adjustment knobs seizing, mounting systems loosening under the shock of battle. But for Unertl, every failure was a challenge to be solved, not a reason to give up. He worked around the clock, implementing modifications designed to address every documented problem. The scope tubes received additional internal sealing to prevent moisture infiltration. External adjustment mechanisms were redesigned with larger, more robust components that could function even when contaminated with sand or salt spray. Each lens was individually tested under simulated combat conditions, including temperature extremes and humidity levels that mimicked the worst of the Pacific. Emma Unertl, managing the business with quiet determination, expanded the workshop's staff, hiring skilled craftsmen and organizing production schedules to meet the military's urgent demands. The shop became a hive of activity, every worker aware that their efforts could mean the difference between life, and death for a Marine thousands of miles away. Each scope required dozens of precision, machined components and hours of hand assembly. Quality control was relentless. John Unertl personally inspected every 10th scope, searching for flaws that could prove catastrophic under combat stress. But even the best engineering could not fully overcome the Pacific's environmental challenges. The Marines in the field quickly learned that survival depended as much on ingenuity as on equipment. Marine armorers at the Philadelphia Navy Yard began developing unauthorized modifications based on field experience. Practical solutions that went beyond official specifications. They experimented with new lubricants, improvised protective covers, and even altered mounting systems to improve stability. The gap between equipment design and operational reality became a breeding ground for innovation. On the front lines, snipers like Sergeant Robert Chun took matters into their own hands. Chen, operating with the 3rd Marine Division on Okinawa, refused to accept the limitations of his equipment. Using salvaged Japanese silk and a healthy dose of marine ingenuity, he fashioned moisture-proof covers for his scope, simple, effective, and easy to deploy in the field. Chen's system allowed him to keep his Unertl scope functional throughout the brutal fighting for Okinawa's southern defensive positions. His kill record, 23 confirmed enemy casualties at ranges averaging over 700 yards, became the stuff of legend. More importantly, his success demonstrated that the equipment could work when operators understood and adapted to its limitations. Chen's story spread quickly through the ranks, inspiring other Marines to experiment with their own solutions. Some used waxed canvas, others repurposed parts from enemy equipment. The message was clear: survival depended on adaptation. The Marines who thrived were those who treated their scopes not as infallible tools, but as delicate instruments requiring constant care and creative problem-solving. Yet for every success, there were still too many failures. The majority of Marines struggled to keep their scopes operational in the face of relentless humidity, abrasive coral dust, and corrosive salt spray. The mounting systems, despite repeated improvements, continued to loosen under sustained recoil. The external adjustment knobs, even when redesigned, were vulnerable to contamination. The psychological toll was immense. Snipers who had once felt empowered by the Unertl system now found themselves second, guessing their equipment at the worst possible moments. The after-action reports reflected this harsh reality. Precision equipment failing under the harsh realities of tropical combat operations. One read: maintenance requirements exceed field capabilities. The words were a death sentence for the Unertl system's hopes of widespread adoption. Orders began to circulate, directing the phase out of the scopes in favor of more robust, if less capable, alternatives. The decision was pragmatic, but it came at a cost. Marines who had invested months mastering the intricacies of the Unertl system now faced the prospect of retraining with simpler gear. The sense of loss was palpable. For John Unertl, the reports from the front were both devastating and motivating. He refused to accept defeat. Every negative assessment became data, information to be analyzed, problems to be solved. He developed new sealing techniques, experimented with anti-fog coatings, and sought out materials that could withstand the Pacific's worst. The environmental challenges faced by precision optics in the Pacific exceeded anything encountered in civilian target shooting. Humidity levels regularly topped 90%, corroding metal surfaces and fogging optical elements, despite every protective measure. Coral dust wore away surface finishes and contaminated lubricated mechanisms faster than field maintenance could address. Salt spray from amphibious operations created additional corrosion problems, attacking both steel and brass components with relentless persistence. The Marines, for their part, continued to innovate. At the Philadelphia Navy Yard, technicians worked with combat veterans to identify practical solutions for environmental protection. They developed new cleaning kits, experimented with desiccant materials, and even modified rifles to better accommodate the Unertl mounting system. The gap between official doctrine and field reality became a crucible for creativity. The story of the Unertl scope in the Pacific became a story of desperation and innovation, of men and machines pushed to their limits, of failures that became opportunities for learning, and of a relentless drive to adapt in the face of adversity. The Marines who succeeded were those who refused to accept the status quo, who saw every setback as a challenge to be overcome. The Unertl system, for all its flaws, became a symbol of that spirit, a reminder that in war, as in life, survival often depends on the willingness to innovate, to adapt, and to never stop searching for a better way. As the war ground on, the lessons of the Unertl scope would not be forgotten. The need for reliability, the importance of matching equipment to environment, and the value of adaptation would shape the future of Marine sniping for generations to come. The Unertl scope had not become the universal solution the Marines had hoped for, but it had opened the door to a new way of thinking. A way that valued ingenuity, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of an edge in battle. And as the Marines prepared for the next campaign, they carried with them not just new equipment, but a new mindset, one forged in the fires of desperation and tempered by the hard-won lessons of innovation. redemption in Korea, the end of World War II, brought a strange silence to the Unertl scope. For years, it had been at the center of a desperate struggle, praised, cursed, modified, and ultimately set aside as the Marines returned to simpler, more robust equipment. Hundreds of M1903A1 rifles fitted with Unertl scopes were packed away in storage, coated in cosmoline, and left to gather dust in forgotten armories. The war had moved on, and so had the corps. The lessons of the Pacific, about innovation, adaptation, and the limits of technology, seemed destined to fade into the background of military memory. But history has a way of circling back to unfinished business. In June 1950, when North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel, the United States was caught off guard. The Marine Corps, like much of the military, had been hollowed out by years of post-war budget cuts. Sniper programs had been reduced to skeleton crews, and the precision shooting skills that had once been a point of pride were now a distant memory. When the call came to deploy, quartermasters scrambled to find anything that could give the Marines an edge. In dusty warehouses, the old Unertl scopes were pulled from their crates, cleaned, and issued to a new generation of snipers, many of whom had never even heard the name. The Korean peninsula was a world away from the jungles of the Pacific. The climate was harsh, but in a different way dry, cold, and mountainous. The air was clear, the visibility often excellent, and the engagement ranges long. For the first time, the Unertl scope found itself in an environment that played to its strengths rather than exposing its weaknesses. The same features that had been liabilities in the tropics, precision adjustments, delicate optics, and long tubes, now became assets. Corporal Robert Williams, a Marine sniper with a Kentucky hunting background, received his M1903A1 Unertl rifle at the Pusan perimeter in August 1950. The scope, still bearing the marks of John Unertl's Pittsburgh workshop, looked old-fashioned compared to newer military gear. But when Williams peered through the 8-power glass, he saw a world transformed. Enemy positions that would have been invisible with iron sights or lesser optics now stood out in sharp relief. The external adjustment knobs, so prone to seizing in Pacific humidity, turned smoothly in the dry Korean air. The mounting system, once criticized for losing zero, held firm through hundreds of rounds. Williams's first real test came during the desperate defense of the Pusan perimeter. North Korean snipers had been systematically targeting Marine machine gun crews, inflicting casualties and threatening to break the defensive line. Williams spent hours observing a distant hill, watching for the telltale glint of a scope or the flash of a muzzle. At a measured distance of 940 yards, he finally spotted his target, a North Korean sniper concealed between two rocks. With careful calculation, Williams adjusted for windage and elevation, using the Unertl's micrometer knobs to dial in the shot. His first round struck home, eliminating a threat that had seemed untouchable. Word of Williams's success spread quickly through the ranks. For the first time in years, Marines felt they had a tool that could match or exceed the enemy's reach. The Unertl scope, once dismissed as too fragile for war, was now delivering first-round hits at ranges that redefined what was possible. Williams's kill record climbed steadily, 12 confirmed enemy casualties by November 1950, all at ranges exceeding 700 yards. More importantly, his success rate approached 90% for first-round hits when conditions were right. The psychological impact was profound. Enemy forces, accustomed to operating outside the effective range of American small arms, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Chinese troops, entering the conflict, discovered that their numerical advantage could be blunted by a handful of well-trained snipers equipped with superior optics. The Unertl scope became a force multiplier, allowing small Marine units to dominate key terrain and disrupt enemy movements with precision fire. The technical vindication of the Unertl system was undeniable. The same external adjustment mechanisms that had failed in the Pacific now functioned flawlessly in Korea's dry climate. The optical clarity, once compromised by tropical moisture, remained pristine through temperature extremes that ranged from summer heat to winter cold approaching -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The mounting system, when properly installed and maintained, provided solid stability through thousands of rounds. The long scope tubes, once considered unwieldy in jungle fighting, proved ideal for the open, mountainous terrain of Korea. Williams's most famous shot came during the bitter fighting around Seoul in early 1951. A Chinese sniper, positioned in a bombed-out factory, had been targeting Marine forward observers, preventing effective artillery coordination. The distance was extreme, 200 yards, well beyond the range of most small arms. Williams spent hours calculating bullet drop and wind drift, using every ounce of knowledge and every feature of the Unertl scope. When the moment came, he fired from a concealed position among the ruins. The bullet struck the enemy sniper in the upper torso, a shot later confirmed by triangulation measurements. It was a new record for Marine precision shooting, and it set a standard that would influence sniper training for decades. Back in the United States, the reports from Korea reached the ears of men who remembered the bitter disappointments of the Pacific. Sergeant James Mitchell, now serving as an instructor at the Marine Sniper School at Quantico, read the accounts with a mixture of pride and regret. He knew better than anyone the pain of equipment failure at a critical moment. But the Korean experience suggested that the Unertl's problems had been less about design flaws and more about the brutal mismatch between equipment and environment. John Unertl Jr., who had taken over his father's business after the elder Unertl's death in 1951, visited Marine installations to gather feedback. The conversations were frank and sometimes emotional. Snipers who had used the system in both wars spoke of its strengths and weaknesses, its moments of brilliance and its moments of heartbreak. Mitchell's assessment was direct. "Your father's scope saved my life more times than it failed me. We just had to learn how to use it properly." The Korean War became the extended field trial that World War II had never allowed. Under the right conditions, with proper maintenance and operator training, the Unertl system delivered precision shooting capability that exceeded anything else in the American arsenal. The vindication was not just technical, but personal, a testament to the stubbornness of a craftsman who refused to give up, and to the adaptability of Marines who learned to make the most of what they had. The lessons of Korea would not be forgotten. The importance of matching equipment to environment, the value of rigorous training, and the need for constant innovation became central to Marine sniper doctrine. The Unertl scope, once a symbol of frustration, was now a symbol of redemption, a reminder that even the most unlikely solutions can find their moment, given the right circumstances. As the guns fell silent and the armistice was signed, the Unertl scope returned to its place in Marine history, not as a failed experiment, but as a legend reborn. Its journey from the workshops of Pittsburgh to the mountains of Korea was a story of persistence, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. And for the Marines who carried it into battle, it was proof that sometimes the right tool just needs the right moment to change the course of war. Legacy and lessons, the story of the Unertl scope is more than a tale of glass and steel. It's a story about the relentless drive to adapt, the courage to innovate, and the high cost of learning in the crucible of war. As the dust settled on the battlefields of Korea, the Marines who had carried the Unertl scope into combat were left with more than just memories of distant shots and hard-won victories. They carried with them a set of lessons that would shape the future of military marksmanship, and a legacy that would echo through the decades. For many, the Unertl scope was a symbol of both frustration and hope. It had arrived in the Pacific as a miracle solution, only to be battered by the realities of jungle warfare. It had been written off as too fragile, too complicated, too civilian for the mud and chaos of combat. Yet, when the world changed and the Marines found themselves fighting in the mountains and valleys of Korea, the same scope, unchanged in its essentials, became a legend. It was a reminder that the value of any tool depends not just on its design, but on the context in which it's used, and the hands that wield it. The Marines who had struggled with the Unertl system in the Pacific learned hard lessons about the limits of technology. They learned that no amount of precision or clarity could compensate for a mechanism that seized up in the humidity or a mounting system that lost zero after a few shots. They learned the importance of reliability, of simplicity, and of matching equipment to the environment. These lessons were written in the after-action reports, in the letters home, and in the scars carried by men like Corporal James Mitchell, who knew firsthand the cost of failure. But they also learned the value of innovation. The Unertl scope was never meant for war, but it became a weapon of war because men like John Unertl refused to accept defeat. Every failure was met with a new solution, every setback with a new modification. The Marines who succeeded with the Unertl system were those who treated it not as a miracle cure, but as a challenge to be mastered. They improvised, adapted, and overcame, turning silk scarves into moisture covers, inventing new cleaning routines, and sharing hard-won knowledge with their fellow snipers. The legacy of the Unertl scope is found in the doctrine that followed. The Marine Corps, once slow to change, began to embrace the idea that equipment must be matched to mission and environment. Sniper training evolved, placing new emphasis on maintenance, fieldcraft, and the ability to adapt under pressure. The lessons of the Pacific and Korea became the foundation for a new generation of Marine snipers, men who would carry the torch into the jungles of Vietnam, the deserts of the Middle East, and beyond. The Unertl story is also a testament to the power of the individual craftsman. In an age of mass production and bureaucratic procurement, John Unertl's workshop in Pittsburgh stood as a reminder that excellence is often the product of obsession, of hands-on care, and of a refusal to compromise. His scopes were not perfect, but they were the best that one man's skill and determination could produce. The Marines who used them knew that their lives depended on the work of someone who cared as much about the outcome as they did. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Unertl saga is the importance of humility in the face of change. The Marine Corps, like any institution, was slow to accept new ideas. The initial rejection of the Unertl scope was rooted in a deep-seated belief in tradition, in the comfort of the familiar. But war has a way of stripping away illusions. The Marines learned, sometimes painfully, that yesterday's solutions are not always enough for today's challenges. The willingness to experiment, to fail, and to try again became as important as any weapon or tactic. The Unertl scope's journey did not end in Korea. Its influence can be traced through the evolution of military optics, from the rugged scopes of Vietnam to the advanced systems used by snipers today. The debates about precision versus reliability, about innovation versus tradition, continue in every armory and training ground. The questions first raised by the Unertl experience. How much complexity is too much? When does innovation become a liability? Are still being asked, and still being answered, by every new generation of Marines. For the men who carried the Unertl scope, the memories are bittersweet. Some remember the frustration of a fogged lens or a seized adjustment knob at the worst possible moment. Others remember the exhilaration of a perfect shot at impossible range, the sense of power that came from seeing farther and striking harder than the enemy ever expected. All remember the feeling of being part of something new, of pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and of learning, sometimes the hard way, that progress is never easy in the end. The Unertl scope stands as a symbol of the Marine Corps' journey from tradition, bound conservatism to a culture of adaptation and innovation. It is a reminder that the path to excellence is rarely straight, and that every advance is paid for in trial, error, and the willingness to keep moving forward. The Marines who carried the Unertl scope into battle may not have known they were making history, but their struggles and successes helped shape the future of military marksmanship. As new wars arise and new technologies emerge, the lessons of the Unertl scope remain as relevant as ever. The need for reliability, the value of innovation, and the importance of matching tools to the task at hand. These are truths that endure. The Unertl story is a testament to the idea that even the most unlikely solution, in the hands of determined people, can change the course of history. And so, the next time a Marine sniper peers through a scope, whether on a distant mountain ridge or in the heart of a modern city, he is, in some small way, carrying forward the legacy of John Unertl, of Corporal Mitchell, of Sergeant Williams, and of all those who learned, through triumph and tragedy, what it means to see farther than anyone else,